Welcome everybody. Great pleasure to invite Giovanni Furlan, who will be familiar to many of you. Giovanni has been in pharmacovigilance for many years, just a few years, probably fewer than me, but good, very similar length. And he's looking much younger than I am. So,
not really.
Giovanni is, we're in the process of developing a special interest group for pharmacovigilance in the elderly, because this is being redefined. Even what does elderly mean? And also there's a lot of interest in inclusion of the elderly more in development and the life cycle of medicines. And therefore, Giovanni has very kindly offered to present on the latest FDA guidelines on geriatric patient safety. And therefore, over to you, Giovanni, if you could present on this for us. Thank you.
You very much, Brian. So here is the usual disclaimer. So why are the elderly different from the general population? Because of the comorbidities, and we know the prevalence of many diseases is age-related. Therefore, they tend to take a number of drugs that increase the risk of suffering from adverse reaction and, of course, drug interactions. But also the pharmacokinetics is not the same. In fact, for example, the adipose tissue versus the total body weight is increased in the elderly. Therefore, the distribution of the hydrophilic and of the lipophilic drugs is not the same as in the young population, and the same is for the plasmatic concentration. Another example of why pharmacokinetics is not the same is that the hepatic blood flow is around 35% lower in the elderly patients. Therefore, there can be decreased metabolism, but also the hepatic mass is reduced in the elderly, and also some metabolic pathways might be altered. However, the most important aspect regards the glomerular filtration rate that tends to be reduced in all of the elderly. And then also the pharmacodynamics is not the same. The elderly can have an exaggerated response to some drugs and a decreased effect to some others. They are also characterized by geriatric conditions such as falls, delirium, urinary incontinence, sarcopenia. And these geriatric conditions can increase the risk of experiencing some adverse reactions, especially with some categories of active ingredients, such as the anti-muscarinic drugs. And we also know that some of the adverse reaction can cause a worsening of the geriatric conditions. Therefore, there can be, in some instances, a bidirectional link. Now, for this reason, the FDA has launched an initiative that is the roadmap for the new drug evaluation in the older adults. They have acknowledged that the clinical trials do not always enroll the patients that represent the target population of those who will take the drug. Therefore, there is a gap in the knowledge, in the safety and in the efficacy of the drugs in the older patients. Now, there are some guidelines regarding safety in geriatric patients that have been recently updated, but the FDA states that other measures will need to be taken to close the knowledge gap that we have. So here is the first guideline I will very briefly present, and it does not specifically regard the elderly because it regards the enhancing the diversity of all of the patients included in the studies. But of course, it is also relevant to the elderly. In fact, it states that medically complex patients can be at increased risk of experiencing toxicity, and therefore they should be included in the studies when it is safe to do so. And these are the organ impaired patients, those with multiple comorbidities, and those who take many drugs. And of course, these are typically the elderly. It also states that the drug metabolism and its excretion should be characterized rather early in the development of the drug, so that the exclusion criteria should be reconsidered as the drug is being developed. And we arrive to phase 3, where the enrolled patients they should reflect as much as we can those who will take the drug in the real life. The additional recommendations from the FDA say that the clinical trials have to be made less burdensome for the patients. For example, for an elderly who cannot go to the clinic because maybe they cannot walk, there should be the medical professional who goes and who visits the patient at her home instead of the patient going to the clinical trials site. And for example, some elderly might have sight problem, cognitive impairment. Therefore, these problems have to be accommodated, and also the clinical trial material has to be simplified for the elderly. They state, for example, that also the sponsors have to engage with the communities, such as the residential institution, so to build a bidirectional relationship. And of course, the voice of the patient has to be heard when you develop the protocol, so that you understand what can discourage the participation of the patients. We then have specifically an FDA guideline regarding the inclusion of the older adults in the cancer studies. They state we know PK and PD are not the same in the elderly. And then, yes, interestingly, it states the spectrum of the older adults that are enrolled in the studies has to be representative of the intended population, not only because of the age, but also because of the physiological decline of the elderly. This is called the frailty, and we know the age does not necessarily represent the frailty of the patients. because we all tend to become old in a different way. That also depends upon our genes, our lifestyle, environment, and by the chance. So the age per se is not the only important parameter to take into account in the elderly patients. And then the guideline states we have to enroll the elderly patients already in the early phase of the studies, so that we can understand what is the dose that the elderly have to take, and therefore they can be enrolled without having too many exclusion criteria in the phase 2 and in the phase 3 studies. However, it isn't that easy to categorize the elderly by the frailty. Therefore, the guidelines then ask to provide the stratification of the elderly by age, not by frailty. However, they recognize the benefit risk in the elderly might be different as compared to that of the overall population. If you think about an elderly patient with cancer and maybe many other comorbidities, such as myocardial infarction, diabetes, renal impairment, is the end point of the study that is important for the patient the survival, or is it rather the quality of the life? For a cancer patient who is elderly with many other comorbidities, maybe they will not have an increased survival, even if you take an anti-cancer drug, because of the other pathologies. So it's important to exactly understand what is important for that specific category of elderly patients. We then have an FDA draft guideline regarding the labeling. And it states, of course, the elderly patients are not a homogeneous group. However, again, the information has to be included depending upon the age, because it's not easy to categorize the elderly depending on the frailty. And you have to take into account all of the information, not only from the clinical studies, but also from the literature and the various case reports, in order to describe in the labeling what is the safety and efficacy of the drug in the elderly. The guidelines requires to say if you have sufficient information to detect the differences in safety and in efficacy in the geriatric patients versus the overall population, and you have to say if you see the differences, if you do not, or if there is insufficient information to say if there is a difference. You have we now will have an ad hoc section that is called the geriatric use in the labeling, where we say how many geriatric patients have been exposed to the drug, and if there were any differences in the safety and in the efficacy versus the younger patients. We have to state if there is insufficient information to make an assessment, and this section has to be cross-referenced with all of the other relevant sections in the label, such as, for example, adverse reactions, clinical study, the dosage and administrations, warnings, and also precautions. So this section is a summary of everything that characterizes the safety and the efficacy of the drug in the geriatric patients. And then if the drug is substantially eliminated by the kidney, you must add a specific statement stating that the risk of adverse reaction can be greater in these patients because of the impaired.
Sorry, can you mute your
function.
phone if you don't have a question? We have a lot of background noise. Thank you.
Yeah. The guideline specifically states there can be a risk of adverse reaction in the elderly patients because they have impaired renal function. So to conclude, you have to know what are the characteristics of the elderly population who will take the drug. So to investigate how these characteristics can influence the safety and the efficacy of the drug as early as you can in drug development, so that in phase 3 we can enroll the patients with the same characteristics as those of the target population who will take the drug in real life. The safety and the efficacy of the information in the elderly will be included in the label, and if there is insufficient information, the FDA might require post-marketing studies. So that was the end of a very short presentation.